started my hike early in the morning. The sun had barely crested the horizon, and the air was crisp, cold enough that my breath was visible. I pulled my jacket tighter and adjusted the straps of my backpack. The trail I had chosen was deep in the national forest, far from any major towns. It was remote, quiet, exactly what I was looking for, a real challenge. The trailhead was nothing more than a dirt lot with an old wooden sign marking the entrance. No other cars were parked there. That didn't surprise me. It was a weekday and this wasn't a popular trail. I had done my research. It was supposed to be about 18 miles and out and back with some rough terrain. The reports I found online said it wasn't well maintained, but that was part of the appeal. The first few miles were easy. The path was mostly flat, winding through thick trees. The leaves had started to change, splashes of orange and red breaking up the endless green. I kept a steady pace, enjoying the quiet. The only sounds were my footsteps and the occasional chirp of birds. About 5 miles in, the trail started to get rougher. The dirt path narrowed, and tree roots jutted out, ready to trip anyone not paying attention. I had to slow down, carefully watching my steps. The sun had risen higher, but the trees were dense enough that only small patches of light filtered through. I stopped for a break near a small stream. Kneeling, I splashed some water on my face, the cold biting into my skin. I took a few sips from my bottle and stretched. That's when I noticed something odd. There were no animal sounds. No birds, no rustling in the underbrush. Just silence. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe I had been making too much noise, scaring everything away. Pushing the thought aside, I continued. The trail climbed steadily now, switchbacking up the side of a ridge. My legs burned, and I had to stop a few times to catch my breath. The air felt thinner up here. After another hour, I reached a plateau. The view was incredible. Endless forest stretched out below, the peaks of distant mountains just visible through the haze. I sat on a fallen log, unzipped my pack, and pulled out a protein bar. As I ate, I checked my map. I was about halfway to my planned turnaround point. Everything was going fine. Still, that uneasy feeling from earlier hadn't completely left. I tried to ignore it. When I stood to continue, I noticed something. A footprint in the dirt. It wasn't mine. It was fresh, the edges sharp. My stomach tightened. There shouldn't be anyone else out here. I hadn't seen another car at the trailhead, and this wasn't a well-traveled route. I crouched down, examining it closer. It was a hiking boot, about the same size as mine. I looked around but didn't see any others. Just that one, slightly ahead of where I had been sitting. I told myself someone else must have come up early, maybe before sunrise. But the thought unsettled me. I had been listening carefully all morning, and I hadn't heard anyone ahead of me.
No distant footsteps, no rustling.
Just silence. I kept moving, forcing myself to stay calm. The trail dipped down into a narrow valley, the trees pressing in closer. The shadows were deep here, the air cooler. My gut told me to turn around, but I pushed forward. Then I saw it. Another footprint, and another. This time there were 2 sets. One was the same as before. The other was barefoot. That stopped me cold. Who the hell hikes out here barefoot? My brain scrambled for explanations, but none made sense. I stood there for a long moment, listening. The silence felt heavier. I shook my head and kept going, walking faster now. I didn't want to turn back yet, but I also didn't want to waste time. The trees thinned out as I climbed another ridge. I was sweating despite the cool air. My ears strained for any sound. A few miles later, I reached a clearing. That's when I saw something that made my blood run cold. A small campsite, abandoned. A single tent stood there, zipped shut. A campfire ring with old ashes sat in the middle. An empty backpack lay next to it, one of the straps torn. A mess of footprints covered the ground, some from boots, some barefoot. I didn't move. My heart pounded. The tent looked like it had been here a while, but I couldn't be sure. I debated checking inside. Every horror movie I'd ever seen screamed at me not to. Instead, I called out, "Hello!" My voice sounded small in the heavy air. Nothing. I stepped closer. The torn backpack caught my eye. It looked like it had been ripped, not cut. Something had happened here. Something bad. I turned around and started back. Fast. My pulse hammered in my ears. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see something. Someone. Following. The silence stretched. Every crunch of leaves under my boots made me jump. I forced myself not to run. Running made people careless. Running got people hurt. Then, ahead on the trail, something moved. I froze. A figure stood in the trees, too far to see clearly. Just a shape, motionless. Watching. I didn't breathe. Then the figure stepped back into the shadows. Gone. I moved. Faster than before, my legs burning. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. The last few miles were a blur. When I finally reached my car, I threw my pack in, yanked the door open, and locked it the second I was inside. I sat there, hands gripping the wheel, heart hammering. My brain screamed at me to leave, but I couldn't move. What had I seen? Who had I seen? After a long moment, I started the engine and pulled out, tires kicking up dirt. As I drove away, I kept checking the rearview mirror. Nothing followed. I never reported what I found. What would I even say? No one would believe me, but I'll never go back there. And I don't think I was supposed to leave. I parked my truck at the trailhead just before sunrise. The drive had been quiet, the road winding through thick forest, mist hanging low over the ground. My plan was simple: a solo hike deep into the national forest, following a lesser-known trail I had read about online. It was supposed to be remote, challenging, and, most importantly, empty. I wasn't in the mood for company. I double-checked my pack. Water, food, first aid kit, extra layers, knife, headlamp, GPS, and a fully charged phone. I had everything. After locking up the truck and making sure I had my keys secured in my pack zipper pocket, I set off down the trail. The first few miles were easy. The path was well-defined, with occasional trail markers nailed to trees. The air was cool, and the damp earth smelled fresh. Birds chirped somewhere in the distance, and I could hear the faint rustling of small animals moving through the underbrush. Felt peaceful. About 4 miles in, the trail split. One direction followed a maintained path, leading to a well-known overlook. The other, fainter trail veered off into the dense trees. This was the one I wanted. I adjusted my pack, took a sip of water, and followed it. The forest grew thicker, and the trail became harder to see. Bushes and fallen branches blocked sections of the path, and I had to step carefully to avoid twisting an ankle. The deeper I went, the quieter it became. The birds had stopped chirping. The wind barely moved the trees. It wasn't unsettling at first, just something I noticed. I hiked for another 2 hours before stopping for a break near a fallen log. I pulled out a protein bar and checked my phone. No service. I expected that. I had downloaded an offline map and marked my starting point, so I wasn't worried about getting lost. The stillness started to feel different now. It wasn't just quiet, it was heavy, like the whole forest was holding its breath. I shook off the feeling and kept moving. The trail became harder to follow, and I found myself checking my GPS more often. Fallen trees forced me to detour, and at one point, I had to backtrack when I realized I had unknowingly strayed from the path. I told myself it was part of the challenge, but I couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that I was being watched. I hadn't seen a single sign of another person since I started, but every now and then, I caught myself glancing over my shoulder. Then I found the boot print. It was old, partially covered in dirt and leaves, but it was there. A single print facing in the direction I had come from. I looked around, but the forest was empty. It was probably from another hiker, I told myself, maybe someone who had been here days ago. But if that was the case, where were the other prints? A single boot print made no sense. I kept moving. The deeper I went, the more I felt it. That strange pressure in the air, like the forest was waiting for something. I moved faster, not because I was scared, but because I wanted to reach the small lake I had planned to camp at before dark. About a mile from the lake, I found something else. A torn piece of fabric, caught on a branch at about chest height. It was dark blue, weathered, and frayed at the edges. I stopped and stared at it. Someone had come this way before me, but how long ago? And why hadn't I seen more signs of them? I pressed forward, my nerves sharper now. My knife was clipped to my pack strap, easy to reach if I needed it. The sun was dipping lower, and the trees cast long shadows across the forest floor. I reached the lake just before dusk. It was smaller than I expected, more like a large pond, surrounded by trees on all sides. The water was still, perfectly reflecting the darkening sky. I set up camp quickly, pitching my small tent and gathering some wood for a fire. I wasn't planning on staying up late, just enough time to eat, maybe write a little in my journal, then sleep. As the fire crackled, I felt it again. The silence, too complete. The air was dead. No wind, no sounds of insects, nothing. Just my breathing and the occasional pop of burning wood. Then I heard it. A single snap, a branch breaking somewhere behind me. I froze. My hand went to my knife, fingers wrapping around the handle. I turned slowly, scanning the trees. Nothing moved. Another snap, closer this time. I stood up, heart pounding. I wasn't stupid, I knew how animals moved. A deer or a raccoon wouldn't walk straight toward a fire like this. I grabbed my flashlight and aimed it into the trees. Nothing. Then, just at the edge of the light's reach, I saw something. A tree, thick and solid, with a shape just barely visible behind it. Not an animal, not a shadow, something human-sized. I didn't call out. I didn't ask if someone was there. My instincts screamed at me to stay quiet. I backed toward my tent, keeping my light trained on the tree. The figure didn't move. It just stayed there, hidden in the darkness. Watching, I made a decision. I wasn't staying here. I wasn't waiting to find out who or what was out there. I killed the fire, stuffed my gear into my pack, and left my tent behind. My flashlight was off now, and I moved fast but quiet, sticking to the trail as best as I could in the dim light. The hike back was hell. Every noise made my skin crawl. More than once, I thought I heard footsteps behind me, matching mine, stopping when I stopped. I never saw anything, but I didn't dare turn around. I just kept moving, forcing myself not to run. Running meant panic, and panic meant mistakes. Took me 3 hours to reach my truck. When I finally saw it, parked exactly where I left it, I almost collapsed from relief. I fumbled for my keys, yanked the door open, and locked myself inside before even turning the engine on. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely put the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life, and my headlights lit up the empty trailhead. Empty, like nothing had ever been there. I didn't stop until I was miles away. I didn't look in the rearview mirror. I just drove. I never went back to that trail. I never told anyone what happened. But sometimes, when I'm alone in the woods, I still feel it. That heavy silence, that sense of being watched. And I know, deep down, that something was out there with me that night. I had planned the hike for weeks. The trail was deep in the mountains, far from the usual crowded spots. It wasn't a marked trail, Just a route I had mapped out using topographic maps and some notes from an old hiking forum. The kind of place you go when you don't want to see another person for days. The drive out took longer than I expected. The last stretch was rough, just a narrow dirt road winding through thick forest, the kind where tree branches scrape the sides of your car. I parked at a small clearing near the start of my planned route. No signs, no designated parking area, just a dead end where the road faded into the woods. I locked the car, strapped on my pack, and started walking. The first few hours were perfect. The trail was steep at times, but nothing I wasn't used to. The forest was quiet, just the sound of my boots on dirt and the occasional rustling in the underbrush. Felt like I had the whole world to myself. Around midday, I reached a ridgeline with a clear view of the valley below. I sat down to rest and eat. The air was cool up here, and the silence was deep. Too deep. It wasn't until I had been sitting for a while that I realized what was bothering me. There were no birds,
No insects.
no wind in the trees, just absolute, heavy stillness. I shook it off, packed up, and kept moving. The plan was to reach a small alpine lake by evening, set up camp, and spend the night there. The trail down into the valley was steep and overgrown. Thick trees closed in on both sides, and the further I went, the darker it got. The silence followed me. No birds, no rustling leaves, just my own footsteps and breathing. Then I saw it. A boot print in the mud, fresh, stopped me cold. I hadn't seen another soul all day. This was supposed to be an unmarked route. Who else would be out here? I looked around. Nothing, just trees and shadows. I crouched down and touched the print. The edges were still sharp, the mud slightly damp. Someone had passed through here recently, maybe an hour ago, maybe less. I stood up and kept walking, faster now. The trail wound down into a thick patch of forest, where the trees pressed in close. My gut told me to turn back, but I pushed on. I had planned this trip too carefully to stop now. Another mile in, I saw more prints. Not just one set, several. And they weren't all boots. Some looked like bare feet. My stomach tightened. The prints crisscrossed the trail, some heading in my direction, some going the other way. It was like people had been walking back and forth here, pacing. I kept moving, forcing myself to stay calm. The lake wasn't far now. If I could just make it there, I'd be fine. I'd set up camp, get a fire going, and push this weird feeling away. But then I smelled it. Rot. Not like a dead animal, worse. Thick, cloying, like meat left out in the sun too long. I gagged and pulled my shirt up over my nose, scanning the trees for the source. That's when I saw the first piece. A strip of fabric, tangled in a low branch, dark, weathered, almost blending into the bark. A few steps later, another scrap, then something else, bone. Small, clean, picked dry, maybe from a deer. But then I saw another one, longer, cracked down the middle. I kept walking, heart hammering. The prints continued, leading me forward. The smell thickened. My legs felt numb, but I didn't stop. Couldn't. Then I reached the clearing. The lake was there, still and black in the fading light. But the shore was wrong, strewn with bones. Some small, some large, some broken open, and the prints led straight into them.
No tents, no campsite.
Just remains. I turned and ran. No thoughts, no plan, just pure instinct. I tore back up the trail, lungs burning, branches whipping my face. I didn't stop, didn't look back. I ran until I saw my own boot prints again, until I saw the first print I had found, now half-dried in the fading daylight. Then I heard it. Not an animal, not a voice, just movement, heavy, fast, coming from the trees behind me. I ran harder. By the time I reached my car, my legs barely worked. My hands fumbled with the keys, shaking so hard I dropped them. I could still hear it, rustling, Footsteps, getting closer. I got the door open, threw myself inside, and locked it. My breath came in ragged gasps as I fumbled for the ignition. The car roared to life. My headlights flashed across the trees, catching something just for a second. A shape, tall, too tall, standing between the trunks, just beyond the reach of the light. I slammed it into reverse, spun around, and sped down that dirt road faster than I ever should have. The trees blurred past. I didn't slow down, not until I was miles away, until I reached pavement and the first cell signal I had seen in hours. I never went back. I don't know what I found out there. I don't want to know. I just know that some places aren't meant to be walked. Some trails aren't meant to be followed. And if you ever find fresh footprints on an empty trail, turn around. Don't wait to see what's making them. The trailhead was empty when I pulled into the lot. The sun sat low in the sky, just an hour or so from setting. It wasn't ideal to start a hike this late, but I had driven 3 hours to get here, and I wasn't about to turn back now. I'd planned to hike up to a fire lookout, spend the night in my bivy sack, and watch the sunrise in the morning. The air was cool, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. I adjusted my pack, checked my water supply, and started up the narrow dirt path. The first part of the trail was easy, gradual incline, packed dirt, the occasional tree root to step over. My boots made a steady crunching sound on the ground. After about a mile, the forest thickened. The trees grew taller, pressing in on both sides, their trunks dark with moisture. The sun slipped lower, casting long shadows across the path. I picked up my pace. I wasn't scared exactly, but I didn't like the idea of setting up camp in total darkness. The further I went, the more isolated I felt. There was no wind, no birdsong, just my footsteps and my breathing. Every now and then, a branch snapped somewhere in the distance. Probably a deer, I told myself. 2 miles in, the incline steepened, and the trail became rougher. Loose rocks and exposed roots made every step deliberate. I adjusted my headlamp as the sky darkened. The trees seemed to close in even more. I kept hiking. Around the 3-mile mark, I noticed something strange. The ground ahead was disturbed. Loose dirt, small rocks scattered, like something heavy had been dragged across the path. I stopped, shining my headlamp over the area. No obvious footprints, no claw marks, no blood. Just something had moved through here recently. A fallen tree, maybe, but there was no tree, no signs of one. The hairs on my arms lifted. I kept moving, trying to ignore the unease growing in my chest. But now I was listening more carefully. Every sound, every rustle, every shift in the trees. Then I saw it. Just ahead, at a sharp switchback, something was hanging from a low tree branch. I slowed down, my heart thudding. It was a piece of fabric, torn, dirty, swaying slightly in the faint breeze. I took a few steps closer. It was part of a jacket, a sleeve, ripped at the shoulder, stained with something dark. I swallowed hard. Could have been dirt, could have been old, but something about it felt recent. I turned, scanning the forest around me. My headlamp beam cut through the darkness, but nothing moved. I told myself to keep going, just keep going. The lookout was less than 2 miles ahead. I had a knife in my pack. I had my flashlight. I had my wits, but something in me resisted. I didn't want to go forward. I didn't want to turn back either. I stood there, frozen, trying to decide. Then, somewhere off the trail, deep in the trees, I heard it. A breath, a long, slow exhale. Not an animal, not the wind, person. I turned my light toward the sound, but there was nothing, just trees and darkness. I stayed completely still, listening, waiting. Then a crunch, a footstep, closer, Every nerve in my body screamed at me to move. I took a step back, then another. I didn't turn my back, but I started retreating, one slow step at a time, my headlamp darting left and right. Another footstep, closer. I turned and ran. I didn't care about making noise. I didn't care about falling. I just ran. My pack slammed against my back. My boots skidded on loose gravel. My breath came fast and hard. I ran until my legs burned, until my lungs felt like they would give out, until I burst back into the parking lot, heart hammering, sweat pouring down my back. I threw my pack in my car, locked the doors, and sat there, shaking. I didn't see anything, but I know someone was out there, and they were watching me. I checked the map again, my fingers tracing the trail that wound through the dense forest ahead. The sun was just starting to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows through the trees. I had planned this solo hike for weeks, choosing a remote trail that wasn't too popular but promised incredible views. It was supposed to be a simple 2-day loop, nothing too extreme, but far enough off the beaten path to feel like an adventure. I packed light, just the essentials, a tent, a small cook stove, enough food for a couple of days, and extra layers in case the weather turned. The first few miles were easy, the trail well-maintained and clear. Birds called overhead, and the cool mountain air felt refreshing. My boots crunched against the dirt path, the rhythmic sound of my steps blending into the quiet rustling of leaves in the breeze. Every now and then, I paused to take a sip of water and admire the scenery. Towering pines, scattered boulders, and glimpses of distant peaks through the trees. Everything felt perfect. A few hours in, the trail narrowed, the trees closing in on either side. The map showed that I was approaching a more rugged section, where the elevation gain would be steeper. I welcomed the challenge, adjusting the straps on my backpack and pushing forward. The solitude was peaceful, but as I climbed higher, the feeling of being alone settled a little heavier in my chest. I hadn't seen another hiker in hours. I reached a clearing just before sunset, a perfect spot to set up camp. The ground was flat, and a small stream trickled nearby. I dropped my pack and stretched, rolling the stiffness from my shoulders before setting up my tent. As I boiled water for dinner, I noticed how quiet it had gotten. The wind had died down, and the usual forest sounds, chirping insects, rustling leaves, were strangely absent. I shook off the unease, telling myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. After eating, I climbed into my sleeping bag, listening to the faint gurgle of the stream. Sleep came in waves, light and restless. I woke up several times, ears straining at what sounded like movement outside my tent. Probably just an animal, I told myself. Maybe a deer or a raccoon. But my gut told me something felt off. Morning light filtered through the tent fabric, and I was relieved to be up and moving again. I packed quickly, eager to put some distance between myself and that uneasy feeling from the night before. The next stretch of the trail was rougher, climbing steadily upward. My legs burned with the effort, sweat dripping down my back despite the cool air. As I rounded a bend, I noticed something odd. A boot print in the dirt, partially smudged but fresh. I hadn't seen or heard anyone else. The sight sent a ripple of discomfort through me. I wasn't sure why. I wasn't afraid of running into other hikers, but something about this felt wrong. The print was large, deeper at the heel, like whoever left it had been moving fast. I hesitated, scanning the trees, but saw nothing. Taking a deep breath, I continued forward, reminding myself that paranoia was the last thing I needed. As the hours passed, I became more aware of my surroundings, listening more intently, glancing back more often. Something felt different now, though I couldn't put my finger on it. Maybe it was the way the wind moved through the trees, or the occasional creak of branches behind me. I told myself it was nothing. I focused on reaching the next waypoint, where the map showed a small ridge with a good vantage point. When I got there, I stopped to rest, my lungs grateful for the break. The view was incredible. Rolling hills stretching into the distance, the deep green of the forest below. I sat on a rock, pulling out a protein bar, trying to relax. That's when I saw movement below, in the trees near where I'd come from. Just a flicker of something dark. My breath caught in my throat. I squinted, searching for whatever I'd seen, but there was nothing now. I stayed still, heart pounding. I was sure someone had been there, watching, following. My mind raced through the possibilities. Maybe a hunter, another hiker, but why wouldn't they have called out? Why stay hidden? The unease that had been growing in my chest spread deeper. I forced myself to move, shoving the protein bar into my pack and heading down the other side of the ridge. I needed to get to my next campsite before dark. My pace quickened, my boots slamming against the dirt. Every so often, I checked over my shoulder, but I never saw anything again. That night, I camped in a thick patch of forest, my tent nestled between trees. I built a small fire, the flickering light making the shadows dance. I didn't eat much, my stomach too tight with anxiety. The silence pressed in around me, thick and heavy. Then, in the middle of the night, I heard it. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, just outside my tent. My blood went cold. I held my breath, straining to listen. The steps stopped. For what felt like forever, there was nothing. Then a sharp, snapping twig. I sat up, my hand gripping the knife I kept next to my sleeping bag. My mind screamed at me to do something, but I was frozen. Then, another sound, footsteps retreating, fading into the woods. I didn't sleep after that. At first light, I packed up in record time, my hands shaking. I practically jogged down the trail, my body running on adrenaline. I didn't stop, didn't look back. I just moved. Hours passed before I saw something that made my stomach drop. A set of footprints, overlapping with mine from the day before. Someone had been following me. I reached the trailhead before noon, practically stumbling into the parking lot where my car waited. I locked the doors the second I got in, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. My breathing was ragged, my heart hammering in my chest. I didn't look back at the trail. I just started the engine and drove. I still don't know who was out there. Maybe just another hiker who didn't realize how they were coming off. Maybe something worse. All I know is I won't be hiking alone again. I had planned the solo hiking trip for weeks. Nothing extreme, just a remote trail in the mountains, far from the crowds. I wanted the solitude, the quiet. My pack was loaded with everything I needed: water, food, extra layers, a first aid kit, and my GPS. The forecast was clear. Everything should have been fine. The trail started easy, a dirt path winding through thick pines. The air smelled fresh, clean. I hiked for hours, stopping now and then to drink water and check my map. There was no cell service out here, which I expected. The silence was nice, peaceful. A few miles in, the path got steeper, rockier. I felt it in my legs but pushed on. The sun was dipping lower, shadows stretching across the trail. I had planned to set up camp at a clearing near a stream, just past a ridge. It wasn't much farther. That's when I noticed something off. The forest had gone quiet. No birds, no rustling leaves, just my own footsteps. I stopped, listened. Nothing, just that thick, heavy silence pressing down. I told myself it was normal. Maybe a predator was nearby, a bear or a mountain lion. Animals go silent when something big is around. I gripped my bear spray tighter and kept walking, but I was on edge now. Every crunch of my boots sounded too loud. I reached the clearing just as the sun dipped below the horizon. The stream was there just like the map said. I set up my tent, boiled some water for my freeze-dried meal, and forced myself to relax. The silence still felt unnatural, but I was exhausted. After eating, I climbed into my tent and zipped myself in. Sleep came slow. I kept waking up, feeling like something was just outside. Every little sound made my heart race. The wind picked up, making the trees groan. I told myself it was just my imagination. I was alone. I had to be. Then, sometime in the night, I woke up completely. Something was off. The air felt too still, too heavy. My body tensed before I even knew why. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Not animal footsteps, too slow, too deliberate. Human. I held my breath, heart hammering. They were close, just outside my tent. I could hear the crunch of leaves, the shift of weight. Someone was out there. I reached for my knife, gripping it tight. My mind raced. No one should be out here. This was miles from the nearest road, and I hadn't passed a single hiker all day. My flashlight was next to me, but I didn't turn it on. I didn't want to make a sound. The footsteps circled my tent. Slow, careful. My pulse pounded in my ears. I lay completely still, every muscle locked. The footsteps stopped at the entrance. The fabric of my tent shifted. Someone was touching it, pressing in slightly, testing. I forced myself to stay silent. If they wanted to get in, I wasn't stopping them from the inside. My best chance was waiting, catching them off guard if they tried. Then, just as slow as they came, the footsteps moved away. I listened, straining to hear over my heartbeat. They faded into the woods, swallowed by the dark. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. At first light, I unzipped my tent, knife still in hand. The forest was normal again. Birds chirping, leaves rustling, like nothing had happened. But I saw them, footprints in the dirt, large, deep, not mine. I packed up fast, barely eating. Every nerve screamed at me to get out. I stayed alert as I hiked back, checking over my shoulder, gripping my bear spray tight. I made it back to my car by late afternoon, legs burning. I locked the doors the second I got in and sat there, breathing hard. I still don't know who or what was out there. Maybe a lost hiker, maybe something worse. But I do know one thing. I wasn't alone that night. I don't know why I thought hiking alone was a good idea. Maybe I needed the space, or maybe I just wanted to prove to myself that I could do it. I had been on plenty of hikes before, but always with friends or in groups. This time, I wanted the quiet, the challenge. I picked a trail in a national forest, one I had read about but never hiked before. It wasn't too far from home, a few hours' drive. The reviews online said it was remote but well-marked, not too difficult, but long enough to make a day out of it. Perfect. I started early in the morning, the sun just starting to rise, as I pulled into the empty parking lot at the trailhead. There were no other cars. That should have been my first warning, but I told myself it was just because it was a weekday. People had work, school, things to do. Not me. I had taken the day off, cleared my schedule for this. I double-checked my pack, water, snacks, a small first aid kit, a knife, my phone, though I already knew there wouldn't be any service this deep in the woods. I also had a small emergency beacon just in case. The first few miles were peaceful. The forest was dense, the trail winding through tall trees that blocked out most of the sky. The ground was damp from recent rain, and the air was cool. Birds called out from somewhere unseen, and the crunch of my boots on the dirt was the only other sound. I felt good, strong, like I belonged out here. A few hours in, I noticed the trail wasn't as well marked as I had expected. The path was still visible, but the occasional signs and blazes on the trees were spaced further apart than I was comfortable with. I kept going, keeping my eyes on the ground, watching for the worn dirt and occasional footprints left by previous hikers. Then, at some point, I must have taken a wrong turn. I didn't notice at first. The path I was on looked just like the one I had been following, narrow, winding, surrounded by thick trees. But something felt off. The further I walked, the less the trail seemed like a trail. The ground was uneven, covered in more leaves than before. I stopped and turned in a slow circle, trying to get my bearings.
No blasses.
No signs, just trees in every direction. I took a deep breath and pulled out my map. According to it, the trail should have looped back by now. I must have wandered off without realizing it. I tried not to panic. I had my compass, my emergency beacon. I wasn't lost. Not really. I just needed to backtrack. I turned around and started walking. The problem was, the way back didn't look the same. I followed my own footprints when I could, but the damp ground made them fade quickly. Every tree looked the same. I walked for what felt like an hour, and the deeper I went, the more I realized I wasn't finding my way back. I was completely lost. Panic started to set in. I forced myself to stop, to breathe. I needed to think. I had enough water and food to last the day. I wasn't in immediate danger. I pulled out my phone. No signal, of course. I considered using my emergency beacon, but something in me hesitated. I wasn't hurt. I wasn't in real danger. Not yet. If I could just find the main trail again, I'd be fine. So I kept moving. The sun was lower now. Shadows stretched long between the trees. I felt like I was walking in circles. Every so often, I swore I saw movement out of the corner of my eye, but every time I turned, there was nothing, just trees. The quiet felt heavier now, more oppressive. Even the birds had stopped singing. Then I saw something up ahead, a structure. Relief flooded me. A cabin? A ranger station? Quickened my pace. But as I got closer, I realized it wasn't a building at all. It was a fire tower, old and rusted. It loomed above the treetops, its metal frame dark against the sky. It must have been abandoned for years. The steps were still intact, though, and if I could get to the top, maybe I'd be able to spot the trail. I climbed, the metal groaning beneath me. The higher I got, the stronger the wind blew, rattling the tower. When I reached the top, I scanned the forest. Nothing but trees. No roads, no trails, no sign of where I had come from. Just endless forest in every direction. My stomach twisted. I stayed up there for a while, hoping to see something, anything that could help me. But there was nothing. As I climbed back down, I heard something. A sound that didn't belong. Footsteps. Not mine. I froze. Listened. The sound was faint but steady, coming from somewhere in the trees. It wasn't an animal. Too deliberate. Too human. I waited, heart pounding, but the sound stopped. I hurried down the last few steps, my body tense. I wasn't alone out here. Someone else was in these woods, watching me. I didn't wait to find out who. I started moving again, faster now, not caring about the noise I made. I had to find the trail. I had to get out. The footsteps followed. They weren't close, but they were there. A steady, deliberate pace, always just out of sight. I forced myself not to run. Running would mean losing control, and I couldn't afford that. I just needed to keep going, keep moving. Then, up ahead, I saw something. A break in the trees. A road. Relief crashed over me. I stumbled toward it, not looking back, not stopping until my feet hit asphalt. An old service road, cracked and overgrown, but a road nonetheless. I followed it, my legs shaking, my breath ragged. I didn't stop until I reached a ranger station, a small wooden building with a radio tower beside it. I pounded on the door until someone answered. A ranger, middle-aged, concerned. I told him I had gotten lost, that I had been followed. He radioed for another ranger to drive me back to my car. As we rode in silence, I kept looking out the window, back toward the forest. There was no one there, but I knew deep down that someone had been, and they had let me go.